Hey YouTube, welcome back to my kitchen. Today I'm really excited to be sharing with you my go-to cornbread recipe. I didn't come up with this recipe, it is King Arthur's maple cornbread, and it is a little bit sweet on its own, but I tend to add things to it, or in this case I'm going to be making it for tonight's Thanksgiving feast. I'll use it to make cornbread dressing, but I made it a couple nights ago to go as a side with some black eyed pea soup. And I also really use this recipe a lot when I have leftover taco meat. I just throw the taco meat in there, maybe some cheese, and I call it Mexican cornbread. So I'll go ahead and show you the tools and ingredients you'll need, and let's get started. For this recipe, you'll need a cup of all-purpose flour, a cup of yellow cornmeal, a tablespoon of baking powder, half a teaspoon of salt, a cup of milk, a quarter cup of maple syrup, 4 tablespoons of butter. I'll be melting this shortly before I pour it into the batter, and if your butter is not marked, 4 tablespoons is about half a stick. 2 large eggs. I've got my large mixing bowl, and you're going to need that. A fork to do the mixing. I've got my parchment paper lined 9x9 baking dish. And last but not least, I'll be doing the toothpick test when it comes out just to make sure it's done. Now when I'm baking, I will always get my dry ingredients ready first. And in this case, I love this recipe because I can just put everything in one of my all the wet ingredients in one of my measuring cups, and only have to dirty up one dish. You can measure out everything so that you have the right ratio of wet to dry ingredients without if I only had 3 tablespoons of butter, I could adjust my maple syrup or my milk or whatever I needed to do to get that right. Got my flour in my bowl, here comes my cornmeal. Level that off. I always want to make sure that I level my dry ingredients off, because when you're baking it's a little bit more important to get the ratio right as opposed to when you're cooking. Baking is much more of a science. Cooking is more of an art. They're both, but got to get my measuring spoons. Tablespoon of baking powder. Half a teaspoon of salt. I know I'm breaking a cardinal rule by measuring over the bowl, but that's how I do. Alright, there's my dry. So I'm going to get that good and mixed up. Oh, and you can use gluten-free flour if you need to do that. I've made this recipe using just generic gluten-free flour. I don't know if it was almond flour. I think it was a mix of maybe almond rice and some other stuff. And it still came out really well. I couldn't even really tell the difference, honestly. It's looking pretty good. Alright, I'm going to set this aside and start working on my wet ingredients. I always melt my butter first in the measuring cup. And cover it and learn a lesson. Well, I got the butter a little warmer than I wanted it, but it'll be fine. It'll cool off in just a minute. And anyway, before I add the dairy stuff, I always, because this does tend to be warm after you melt it, I always start off with the maple syrup. So 4 tablespoons of butter is about a 1/4 cup. And so we also need a 1/4 cup of maple syrup, so I'm just gonna fill it up to the 1/2 cup line. Mix it a little bit just to sort of release some of the heat from the butter and mix it with the cold maple syrup that just came out of the fridge. Alright. Then we need a cup of milk, so it's up to the 1/2 line now, so I'm going to fill the measuring cup up to the 1.5 cup line. Good. And if you let this sit a minute or two, it separates into these really pretty layers. I don't know how well you can see that. Probably not very well. With the maple syrup on the bottom, the milk, and then the butter on top. Alright, last I'm going to crack my eggs in here. Get these nice and whipped. And once I'm sure the eggs are not whole anymore, I will go ahead and add this into the dry ingredients. And the recipe says to just mix until there's not really any more heavy wet spots. Let me see exactly what it says. Add the liquid to the dry ingredients and stir until just moistened is what it says. I always mix it so that I don't see any more dry spots, which they say you want that. It helps with the crumb, but I've always done it this way and I like it this way. Now when it's at this stage, this is when you can add your taco meat, your cheddar and jalapenos, or whatever else you would want to add in here, your any kind of seasonings, corn, whatever you want. This is about the thickness that it is. And then because I did it the lazy man's way and using parchment paper, if you weren't doing that, you'd want to make sure this was buttered and have flour or cornmeal scattered around so that the cornbread wouldn't stick. I should be using a spatula for this. And once you've got the bread in your baking pan, you're gonna want to pop it into your oven set at 425 degrees and bake for about 20 to 25 minutes. Well, my timer just went off for 20 minutes, so I will let you see what this looks like. It's pretty good. I'll do a quick toothpick test. There we go. All right, so I think we're good.